I'm very excited that we have Kristian Nielsen with us today. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Management, Society and Communication. Previously, he was a postdoc in psychology and zoology at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on behavior change for climate change mitigation and conserving biodiversity, and he's one of the most important scholars in this field. His publication record is full of bangers, and his research was featured in the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 3 contribution to the IPCC. So as we learned previously, it's approved by Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and the US. And he consulted for the Netflix documentary, Don't Look Up, around the climate action guide that they put out. But you would never learn about this from Kristian because it's way too humble to talk about these things. He's the first behavioral scientist we have at ACSCC. And when we thought about having a behavioral scientist, it was completely clear who we would invite. He's not only a great researcher, but a fun guy to hang out with. And we're very happy that he's here today as well as tomorrow. So if you can't get your question in, just bother him in the breaks. Without further ado, please, Kristian.
Thanks a lot, Fabian. It's really great to be here. And it's only going to go downhill from here. Yeah, it's a really great community. And I'm really excited actually to join today and tomorrow. And I think it's an amazing event, bringing so many different disciplines and backgrounds together. I think that's exactly what we need to tackle climate change. Like we need diversity of input and experience. So I'll do basically the other side of the coin from what Michael was talking about. So I'll do it much more at the individual level. So what is the role of behavior change in tackling climate change? And actually a lot about that. I'll try to focus on one key point and then share a little bit of what I'm trying to do moving forward and how that interacts a little bit with policy. So, nope. But perhaps. So I always start with this slide, and I don't want to go into too much detail because we got a really excellent introduction to where we are, what are the states of affairs. Maybe one thing I just wanted to add is sort of the rate of reductions in emissions are almost similar to what we experienced in COVID. So basically, that's the rate of change every year we need to do. And we can always imagine, like we can easily remember how many sort of policies were implemented that restricted our movement patterns, for example, for transportation. So this is basically where we are if we want to get to 1.5. So I agree. No? Anyway, we got one. But what I will focus on is more on when countries make policies and pledges, how do we actually implement them in practice? And that will influence us as people and also our behavior, but not all equally. And I'll particularly highlight that part.
We think, can you try?
Yeah. So,
but can you try with it?
Yeah. Okay. So when you work on individual behavior, you're often confronted with, by some even in the climate community, a dismissal that we don't need to focus on individuals because you individualize climate change is basically doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry, and they have very vested interest and they want to delay and so on. So part of my social media campaign, if you will, is basically to try to dispel this sort of narrative because I think it's incredibly unproductive. So, but to contextualize that, the fossil fuel industry has been trying, they have tried to individualize it. So they would say individual consumers can just change the behavior if they want to, basically. And then the additional point would be BP invented the ecological footprint. So if you talk about carbon footprints, again, it links to the fossil fuel industry. One, they didn't invent it. It was in, like the carbon footprint dates back to the 90s. But even if they didn't invent it, it's still useful for certain purposes. And I'll talk about some of these because it allows us to talk about what are the carbon footprint of countries, of cities, companies, but also individuals. And I'll highlight particularly why for the latter, it's quite a useful tool. So I think this debate where we dismiss one side of the coin is quite unproductive because in the end, individuals operate within systems, but systems are also a function of the individuals that comprise that system. And I would propose, and we can talk about that it's very unlikely you get system change without any sort of push from the bottom as well. So you need people in countries to also see themselves as being part of this system level changes. And I'll give a few examples of some of the work Fabian and I have been doing that links perceptions of behavior change to policies. But again, we basically need at this point everything because the scale of change is so rapid. So at the system level, we do need fundamentally to reshape incentives in society. We need to change norms. We need to change infrastructure because sometimes the behavior changes that I would say are needed are prevented for real by different barriers in infrastructure, for example, whether it's in the food system, transportation system, housing, there are infrastructural barriers, there are incentive barriers as well. We should address those. But our proposal is that some people already don't experience a lot of barriers, but are not doing what I think they could do to reduce them. So what we also do is we need behavior change that then align with those systems, but also maybe because the feasibility is shorter, so I can change my diet today, that will then help push for some of the system level changes. So there's a clear interaction there where if you see yourself as being part of this transition, maybe you also support more ambitious policies. So when I talk about behavior, or when in the public media, or in the media, or even in public discourse, when we talk about behavior, we typically think about consumer behavior. And that's meaningful because consumption is where most of our emissions are coming from. So typically that's housing, it's transportation, and it's food. Those are sort of the big chunks at the individual level. But there are other pathways, typically more indirectly, where we can also influence climate change mitigation. So what we've been trying to do, I'm not the only one that's been pushing for this, but I sort of piggyback off that agenda, is to broaden out what we would call roles or spheres of life, where you can also influence climate change mitigation. So we don't only conceive ourselves as being consumers, but also as citizens, also as parents, also as employees, also as investors. So sort of broaden out the diversity of roles where some people more than others can influence mitigation, but basically get away from only consumption being the only realm of action that we can do as individuals. So I think that's quite important. And through these different roles, people can promote climate action or they can also prevent it. And we can easily come with examples of people that prevented it. So that could be fossil fuel executives, certain politicians. They've been incredibly effective of undermining climate change mitigation. I mean, the typical example we will give is the Koch brothers in the US. And they've been sponsoring climate-related misinformation for decades. They've set up think tanks. They've set up university departments or institutes that are basically set up to sort of promote their material interest or financial interest, which is not aligned with climate change mitigation. So, but I just wanted to broaden out this conceptualization. And it's still not being that, I would say, that dominant in the behavioral sciences yet. So still we see a big skew towards consumption. Again, it's important, but there are other aspects. So I think as a behavioral scientist, if we broaden out this conception, there's also a bigger role for our insights, I think, to integrate into the climate policy, for example, or even broader climate change mitigation discourses. Because at the moment, behavioral science is really operating at the fringes. So we are not part of any sort of, even in the IPCC, behavioral science has a very small role. It's increasing over time, but it's minuscule. So you see it in the mitigation and adaptation now, but it's quite small. And we can talk a lot about that. But basically, I think we will need our science as well. But we should just justify our role, our increasing role. So the key point I will talk about I'll give in my talk is basically who is it that then need to change. So I think it's unavoidable if we are to mitigate climate change that some people have to change. Because the way we eat at the moment is just not at all aligned with the 1.5 scenario. And then we have the biodiversity crisis here, where food is the key driver of that, the food system. Same with transportation. So we will need to change how we transport ourselves. Again, some more than others, and housing and so on, and the consumer products that we demand. And here comes inequality. So whenever I now give a talk, I always talk about inequality, because I think it's key to climate change as a whole. It's incredibly unequal. And I try to summarize that in 3 sentences. So one is there's inequality in who causes climate change. You can see that at different levels. I'll talk about the individual here. Then there's inequality in who experiences the worst consequence of climate change. And that's the real tragedy of climate change, is that the people that have done very little to cause the problem are experiencing disproportionately effects of climate change. And then there's inequality who can influence efforts to mitigate climate change or to not mitigate climate change. And what I'll do in my talk is to briefly talk about 1 and 2, or 1 and 3. So I'll leave this sort of adaptation or impact side for somebody else. So inequality in climate change. So one way to look at this is carbon footprints. And we now have quite a lot of evidence on what are the carbon footprints across different countries. So what is shown here is from a paper in Nature Sustainability in 2022 that showed the average carbon footprint more or less across the world, not entirely. And the more blue, the lower is the carbon footprint. So in countries in Africa, the average carbon footprint is around 1 ton, even less than 1 ton per capita. That's the average carbon footprint. And this is from consumption of goods and services. So that's the definition here. But obviously, it's not surprising if you go to Europe, if you go to North America, also increasingly actually in the Middle East, even though not depicted here, the carbon footprint increases quite a lot at the average level. Sometimes a factor of 20 difference between the highest emitting to the lowest. But again, these are averages. And in the US, a lot of people, 330 million or something. And there's a lot of variability within that country. So another way to slice it is to look at differences across income groups. And on the left, you see a graph from Lucas Chancel's work and the World Inequality Lab. And what you see is that the average emissions across different income groups globally. This is at the global level. So the average across the world is around six tons per year, whereas the average carbon footprint within the bottom 50%, so half the world population, is 1.4 tons. And as you increase the income ladder, you get to the top 1%, it's 29 almost tons per year. You get to the top 1%, it's around 100. If you zoom even further into that, on the right, you get to the 0.01%, we can be in the thousands a year. Typically where it scales is related to transportation. So it's typically flying. That's the biggest chunk normally. Because there's only so much food you can eat. Unless you fly in your baguette from, I heard stories about that, from Paris to New York. But basically, that's where there's a limit. So it's typically transportation where it gets difference. And that relates to who is it that then need to change their behavior. It's not really most of the people on the planet. They'll have to change their behavior to improve their lives, typically. So they need to adopt new services that are better for health and so on. So there will be a behavior change in that because they need to uptake new technology and so on. But for a small proportion of the world planet, we are talking quite radical changes. And what I'll talk about is that these people also have political power, fortunately. So I've now,
Can I ask a quick question? These statistics are also viewing people solely as consumers, or are they?
Yeah, so these are, so that's only from goods and services.
And is there ways to view this, or will you be talking about ways to view this where we look at people as more than consumers?
So I'll talk about a little bit about that, but it's not depicted in those numbers. But there have been some attempts to include investment, and that actually links to my next slide. So private investments is one way where you can, you have stocks in a company, and through that you can influence mitigation, negative bad or negative good. But there's also some contention about whether that's fair or to what extent that's fair. So if I own 0.01% of a company, I don't have a lot of influence on that company. You can say I can take my money somewhere else, and I think that's a useful part. But if I own 50% of the company or 51% of the shares, obviously you have a lot more influence on what goes on in the thing.
That's national household spending also not, right? For example, the provision.
So that is not included there, but typically the way it will be done, and that links to my next slide actually. So the attempts that have been done to broaden out from consumption of goods and services, private investments, also public investment. So there'll be like provisioning of hospitals, schools, and so on. But the way normally that's distributed equally across the population. And you can say, is that fair or not? But basically that's the way. So we don't have a lot of inequality. One paper we published a few years ago was basically to see to what extent are people in different countries aware of inequality within their own country. And we can talk a lot about, do people even have well-developed perceptions of this? So this is more of a, I would say, more or less descriptive exercise. But basically what we did within 4 countries, So we asked in Nigeria, Denmark, India, and the US. Within each country, we recruited 500 people from the top 10% of income in that country because they made the most. So I was quite interested in that. And then 500 from below that threshold. And then we saw to what extent can they, or is the perception of the average carbon footprint within 3 different income groups. So the bottom, again, mimicking the other one. So bottom 50%, top 10%, top 1%. And what you see, the blue dots are individual estimates. So that will be the guess. And then the red dot is what is the actual number. So what you see, actually in India and Nigeria, the estimates are not that far off. One reason for that is the absolute differences are not that great. So what we did, we gave them the average within their countries as a reference point. But whereas in Denmark, where I'm from, or the US, yeah, they're really underestimating how much inequality there is. And if you want to compare estimates, linking to what I talked about before, from Nigeria to the US, so the average within the top 1% of income in Nigeria is around 8.8 tons a year. And roughly, I mean, slightly smaller population than the US, whereas the US is 270 tons per year, this is including private investment. So it does go up. Again, the differences are quite staggering.
I'm curious if you have data on how well people are able to place themselves in these income groups. So I sometimes show these to my students, and then they often say, "Yeah, but I'm just a student, so I'm somewhere in the bottom 50." And then I say, "Well, actually, most people in the Netherlands are in the 10, and it sort of is surprising to them." So
we didn't do that here, but there's a little bit of work about economic inequality where people face them, because typically, even in the wealthiest part, they're surrounded by wealthy people typically. So you feel poor, and you're not always aware about what other people's income are. Yeah. So I think not always people will be very clear.
Yeah, because I think then you can also get that people think that they belong to a lower income group and therefore don't feel the individual needs to do as much.
Yeah. Anyway, this is just as a more or less descriptive exercise because
But this is still within a country.
Yes. So it's like
the socioeconomic background, the thing is still within a country.
Yeah.
But people
so
be better within a country than across.
That was our reasoning because at least you have some inferences about what other people in your country are doing, whereas some people struggle to do that for Nigeria if they're from the US and so on.
Sorry, could I just ask, did you have the same people rate across all conditions? So for the top 10, because, okay, look at the graph for Nigeria. Don't you think it's interesting that they put like the bottom 50 higher than like way higher, but that's not the case for like top 1%?
Yeah, so it's.
If you look into like, I mean, I know that's not a lot of data points, but I think it's completely the other way around.
Yeah, but there's because we also asked them for comments.
Yeah.
Basically, sometimes if they think you have a high income, you can afford sort of low carbon technologies. So it could be you have an EV, I mean, that's my solar panels, something else, whereas that might not be accessible for a lower income household, which is true sometimes. That could be, I mean, speculation, right? But I think that could be, some people wrote that in the comments. Anyway, first crack at seeing are people aware about this inequality, and I don't think it is. And I know I can speak most confidently about my own country. Inequality is not something we talk about. You know, we're a very equal country in Denmark, so we don't have to deal with this. You look at this, and of course, it's not true. Even in Denmark, which is much more equal than the United States. Anyway, so there's inequality in this. People are not always available or are not always aware of this. So my somewhat famous paper, I guess, is this one, which we published in 2021, where we said these different roles. So we tried to broaden out the conceptualization of individual behavior. Then we identified 5 roles, there could be others, where there's inequality and to what extent you can use it. So far, I mostly talked about consumer role. So there are a lot of differences across income groups or different groups. Investment is also pretty clear. The more money you have, the more wealth you have, the more you can invest. So through that, you can allocate an emissions factor to that. Then there's also a citizen, and this varies quite a lot between and within different countries. So if you're live in a democratic country, you can vote, and that vote will have some effect on the political system. Whereas if you don't live in a democratic country, it can be more difficult. But voting is only one way where you can have an influence. So we can also protest. for example. We can build sort of campaigns around our interests, and that is a lot easier if you have a lot of money and have a big social network. So if Leonardo DiCaprio wants to do a climate campaign tomorrow, it will be easier for him to recruit people to join his campaign than if I did it, and similar to somebody else. So we see this where people can rally around their interests much more easily than somebody else. Then if you have typically quite high wealth or sort of prominent organizational position, you can get easier access to policymakers. So you get a foot in the door, you can get a meeting with a policymaker, you can express your interests, and therefore it's more likely you influence policy. Then in organization, the higher up you are in the food chain, it's not surprising, the more influence you have over the decisions. And particularly in companies, they're not rarely democratic institutions. So basically, more or less similar to dictatorship, some of them. But basically, some decisions are made by quite a few people. And that could be anything from obviously high-level strategy to high-level contracts, but it could also be procurement contracts. And these can influence emissions, not only from the company itself, but also the supply chain. And that's one avenue where you can try to also influence mitigation. Then finally, as a role model, so some people shape social norms much more than others. So if you're a famous person, whether it's because you're an actor or you're a politician or you're Elon Musk, you shape narratives around what constitutes particularly a good life or successful life. And at the moment, that's very high carbon. So that is material possessions, it's power, and that's something I think we really heavily need to attack. So this is not the only way, and I think Julia will talk about this tomorrow. But we need to reshape this because people at the moment are aspiring to this across many countries in the world. And I think that we have to retailor the story of what is a good life. So how does this link to policy? So Fabian and I have been trying to figure out a little bit what are people's perceptions of the extent to which they can change their behavior. And what I would say, just to preface this, is that if you are a wealthy person, I would say it's easier to change your behavior, at least in most behavioral contexts. And I'll say it for a few reasons. So one is that
So a slightly late question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like we quantified the inequality in the causing of climate change, and also a way to quantify the inequality in influence on climate change.
in principle, if you can get data on that, yes, yeah. But obviously,
And have people done that before? Are you doing it?
no, I don't. Because I mean, causally, it's also really difficult. So if I take a meeting with a policymaker, do I cause whatever policy outcome downstream? So quantifying that will be difficult. Sometimes you have clear case studies where you can say, probably likely. Like in Denmark, for example, we have one of the world's first carbon taxes, I think, on air travel. It's tiny, so it's not impressive. But basically, the exemption was private air travel. One reason is we have a billionaire that has a private air travel company, and he's one of the wealthiest guys in Denmark. And so it's pretty clear he lobbied it, right? And so the excuse was that they don't get a ticket when you fly private air travel, so therefore we can't put the tax on. Literally, that's the excuse.
But it could be direct or indirect influence.
Yes.
For example, last week, Joe Rogan was in the White House.
Yeah.
Where he said something about the drug in his podcast, and the Trump signed an executive order saying, "Oh, you said it, so here you go."
Exactly. Yeah.
That's like he didn't ask for it like directly, but like he suggested it, and we took the debate, and then he did it. And that's like indirect influence.
That we know.
You see, yeah, recent.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you can document these. I mean, I think the analysis will be quite difficult, but it speaks to a little bit this sort of, if you have a big audience, your opinion gets out there and your behavior comes out there. So that's one lever of influence, for sure. And that's a good example of that. And Trump is very sensitive to some of these, but other leaders are as well. So basically, just to come back to one of the reasons why I think behavior change is easier on average for wealthier people is I can outsource a lot of the behavior change process. So if I want to buy solar panels for my house, or if I want to buy an electric vehicle or whatever, renovate my home, it's quite a complicated decision because you need to figure out what is the right, or heat pump, for example, what is the right heat pump for my house? Where do I access this? What is the price? Are there any subsidies that I can utilize? And it's a difficult process. It's confusing if you don't have technical expertise. Whereas if I have some wealth, I can outsource that process to a company that will handle it for me, typically. So I can just do that. And the same with sort of behavior change, like changing my diet. So I always give an example. So if I want to eat plant-based and I don't have a lot of wealth, I need to figure out what constitutes a plant-based diet. So what are the ingredients? What are healthy meals? I need probably to learn new recipes. That's quite a complicated skill development process. If you have my level of wealth, I can just buy, a meal program. So I have this 4 times a week. I have to cook the food myself, but I get the meal plan and the ingredients. So somebody fixed that for me. And if you're really wealthy, you get a private chef. Right? So they handle all that. So that's just an example of how you can outsource some behavior change. Then, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US was heavily about subsidies. But it's not always that easy to figure out how do I get these subsidies. And even if you set aside that it's usually a financial investment, you also need to be able to afford. But figuring out what are the subsidies, how do I get access to them, is quite complicated. And what we typically see is that these subsidies are disproportionately utilized by wealthy individuals because they can, again, outsource it, or they know the system well enough where they can access these. So even if it was wasn't the intention that there was inequality in this, usually it ends up being this. And then finally, if I want to, for example, not be dependent on a car, I move to the center of Copenhagen because I can afford that. Whereas if you don't have, that level of income or wealth, you're forced to the suburbs, typically locked into different movement patterns to get to work, for example. So you're forced to have a car. So they become much more at the hands of the infrastructure. So therefore you face greater behavioral barriers. So what we wanted to come back to my paper with Fabian is, to what extent do people across different income groups perceive this potential? And we're not really getting at that very well yet, but we're trying, I would say.
It's kind of transmission and house technologies, but I in a way to also speak before sometimes when it goes to a lot of like getting a lot of well, maybe also more locked in to kind of this calculate everything as in quantitative.
Yeah.
So I can kind of on more the psychological part there is going for things that you could indeed more easily maybe do, like kind of psychological part of it.
There are a lot of complex psychological processes, but generally people don't like giving up things.
Yeah.
And if you have a very cushy life today, why would you want to give that up? I think it's a reason. And that does link a little bit, actually, I forgot to mention, to some of the policies that people with that kind of lifestyle, you could say, are advocating for. So for example, typically in high income countries, we disproportionately talk about technology. And that's a way to preserve more or less the status quo, because we just buy an EV instead of a fossil fuel car, but the service is similar.
Yeah.
Whereas when you talk about radical demand reduction, it gets into complicated territory where some people have to give up stuff. Same with air travel. Like air travel is usually the most complicated case for when you live in countries that are well accustomed to being able to fly all the time, even if it's unequally distributed within countries. Because technologically, it's just so difficult to decarbonize aviation. And that means at some point, if you want to tackle this, you have to talk about demand. And it's just not popular for many different reasons. So what we did using the same data from this perceptions of carbon footprint study we did was to ask, what is the likelihood that you implement a certain behavior change within the next 1 to 2 years? And we did this across 10 different behaviors. And it's all over the place. Basically, like patterns are pretty difficult to understand. But I think one that is particularly pops out to me is in the US and Denmark for air travel. So what you have on the x-axis is basically income group. The further you go to the right, the higher is the income. And what we see is that the perceived likelihood of reducing air travel is lower for high income individuals, even though they're most likely also are much more likely to fly. And this is just an example, because at the individual level, flying is typically the biggest chunk of your carbon footprint. What we also then tried to look at was linking these perceptions of the likelihood of behavior change to the support for different policies. So what we then tried to do was to ask for policy support measure that related to that behavior. So we did this for 3 different things. So to what extent would you support and carbon tax on air travel, linking it to flying, and then meat tax, linking to likelihood of reducing meat consumption, and then private investment things. And what we found is pretty high correlation generally between likelihood of behavior change and support for policy. And again, if I could tie back to the beginning, is that if I see myself being likely to change my behavior, I support policies that would help me do that behavior. In principle, it could have gone the other way. So it could be because I can change. I don't want policies, I don't need policies that will help me. But I think it's speculation, but it speaks to the social diffusion, I guess. Basically, you want other people to change too.
Do you also observe this for subsidies versus taxes? Would that be different?
So I can't remember actually if we have that. I'm not sure. Generally, people prefer subsidies over taxes. Like taxes are popular, even in
But if I were to, I'm just guessing, if I were to change my behavior anyway,
Yeah.
maybe I care less about whether other people get taxed for
Right.
changing.
Yeah,
or
could
not
easily.
changing that.
I mean, that I think we have some evidence that, if you're not affected by the policy that much, I support the tax generally. So I think that we have some evidence for that. But so we see a positive correlation between these across income groups as well. But what we see is that the association is slightly higher for the higher the income is. So we see a more positive association across different income groups. I mean, you can speculate a million reasons why that. It could be greater political capital, so you have greater influence on policy processes or whatever. I think that's for future research to decide. But basically, we see some relationship there. Then I just want to briefly talk about something, and I don't know if it's present here, but when you're a behavioral scientist, also in policy circles, people always think about behavior change interventions as being nudging. And I think that's Kristian Stevens. I mean, he's done some good. He's also been excellent in sort of advocating for nudging as a behavior change intervention. So it's not the only thing, I would say. So what behavioral science can do, I think, to the policy table is to bring new sorts of behavior change interventions. And it's also making conventional ones more effective. So if you have a climate policy or want to implement a tax, for example, how you communicate it is really important. Example. So we have some evidence on that. But I'm very specific and deliberate in how I say behavior change interventions and not behavioral interventions. And I learned this from Teresa Matteau in Cambridge. Like she stopped me immediately when I said behavioral interventions. But basically, it links to how you conceptualize that. So the way C and now me sees this is any intervention that would change your behavior is a behavior change intervention. And that could be a tax, that could be an institutional policy, but it might influence my behavior, and therefore it's a behavior change intervention. So it doesn't matter if it's nudging or something else. But I mean, this is just another typology of class, like an overview of different intervention classes. But basically, some behavior changes are not happening not only for motivational reasons. So just appealing to financial incentives might get you somewhere, but like changing a diet is not only a motivational problem. So you also need to reflect that, like in building capability, and that's not only at the household level, but it's also chefs, for example. They need to learn how to create new dishes so they can serve them to other people. It's a capacity problem, a capability problem, not a motivational one, or at least not only. Same, so where we position nudging is like changing features in what we say physical microenvironments, so decision contexts like this one. So if I manipulate certain features, that might influence your behavior. But it could also be obviously infrastructure that shapes what behaviors are possible and how easy they are and how like accessible they are to different groups.
I didn't understand what was wrong with behavioral interventions.
So basically, you can easily use behavioral interventions, but it signals that the intervention itself more or less comes from behavioral science.
Directly towards behavior.
That was her opinion. I sort of share it. It's terminology. But in the end, I think it's how we talk about this because it does link to what other disciplines are talking about. So economists, they love financial incentives, right, or taxes or something. And I think they're useful instruments, but they also behavior change.
There's also a little bit of this link that behavioral intervention somehow directs more towards individual level interventions, where behavior change, when we think about financial incentives, also captures structural and collective.
Exactly. So, and they're different. I mean, depends on what group's behavior do you want to change and how specific do you want to target them only, or do you want to change everybody that goes in an environment? So if I want to change everybody's behavior, transportation, or let's say transit behavior in Amsterdam, I'll probably reshape the urban planning or something. So that's one way you could do it. But it could also be I just wanted to change this group's behavior, and therefore I wanted to have a target intervention that will, I don't know, address motivation or capability or something. So that, I mean, there could be different levels there. Anyway, it's just a big look. And because I have 10 minutes, should I?
7.
Okay, I'll say something very quickly. So I'll skip this, but basically I think we as a behavioral science have a big problem that we don't have good data. And data is not always the solution, but if you want to work with behavior, you need to be able to measure behavior and not intentions or self-reported behavior. And that is not only a problem for the science, like behavioral science, but it's also a problem if you want to work in policy with behavior change. And I can give an example of this in Copenhagen, and I'll speak to a project I'm trying to get funded, but not succeeded, which is basically some municipalities, and now an increasing number of municipalities in Denmark, have set pretty ambitious consumption-based emissions target. And that, for example, Copenhagen, they want to reduce their consumption-based emissions by 50% in 2035. And if taken seriously, that's a fundamental transformation of how people in Copenhagen live their life, because it includes, again, housing, mobility, or transportation and food. So it means radical cuts to meat consumption, flying is there, car driving, and so on. But what they are struggling with is to, one, understand what are the consumption-based emissions, then measuring the individual behaviors you need to change to meet that target. And that leads to a lot of problems because you're operating in a fog, basically. And it means you also don't know who does what within your city. And that links to the inequality point. So you don't know who flies the most. You don't know who eats the most meat. And therefore it becomes really difficult to target interventions and evaluating whether they work or not. And then even if you had that, what we would like to do, and I think is really important, is to measure other important indicators of how people are being affected by policies. So it's not only, even if you measure behavior, some people will lose. Like you implement any policy, there'll always be winners and losers. And I think if we don't take this into account, like the well-being aspects, social processes, whatever it can be, loneliness, something like this, it's really important for evaluating what effects the policies have, to then also be able to identify who lost from this and how do we capture them. And I think, for example, Denmark last year, we had municipal elections, and their solar panels have been incredibly politicized because some people lost a lot from building out solar panel farms, because their entire small towns have been completely surrounded by this, like solar panel farm. So they're losing, and then the populist right, see them, grabs them, and then they go into the right wing, and then you undermine climate policy all over. So I think this is also sort of a prevention. And at the moment, we are not steering after this whatsoever in Denmark, and probably the same in many other countries. So we're not optimizing. What we're optimizing for is economic costs, benefits, and then sometimes, if you're lucky, also behavior. So I think we need, as a collective, and not only in behavioral science, but to much more broaden out the palette of different indicators of how people are being affected by policy. So we're trying to get this funded. It's a long process. Working with Copenhagen.
So I come from an economic background, not a behavioral scientist, but I have this in my mind. How can we persuade people that having less amenities and less material conveniences in their lives will be better for them? And better for them as a part of the society?
Yes.
How?
I think that's also for lunch. But what I would say is incredibly complicated, and it would vary between different people. Like some people giving up flying is not a problem, or some people giving up flying is a big problem, and so on. You can do that the same for different behaviors. But I think targeting this sort of representation of a good life is a good place to start. And then I would say if you can also then measure how people's well-being being affected by certain policies. Say you closed off entire inner Amsterdam from cars. How people that live in Amsterdam being affected by this. Not only their behavior, mobility, so on, but also their well-being, social cohesion. So does it facilitate you getting out more, getting more exercise, whatever, or you sort of gathering in squares and so on. That is not being measured really. And that also means it's not quantified, and therefore it doesn't go into the political policy, like process of weighing the pros and cons of different interventions and so on. And I mean, we shouldn't wait out for this, but I think we need to consider some of these different. And then I think if you can document this, you can say, look, people benefited from this, or most people benefited from this. And therefore I would predict that it's more likely other cities, countries would follow, or take this as a good case, right? For example, Paris, like they build out biking infrastructure incredibly fast, and that has inspired other ones. So it doesn't have to be perfect evaluation, but sometimes just somebody leading, communicating, evaluating. It's a really good place to start, I would say. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm also thinks, curious if you have evaluate, for example, not only individual change, but also like if what does we need to enable in order for an individual also in this perspective, right? Acknowledge they are part of something else, right? As a community, as whatever, as more consumers, as people that influence policy. If you are also considering these kind of investigations, research, conducting or evaluation, when do we transition from like a sense of individual agency and efficacy to a more like a collective efficacy or collective agency? In these, like on the transitioning, it would be great to see what does it enables that transition, also in the perspective of an individual part of what. I think more like a country level, also like what happens on societies that are more individualistic versus ones that are more collectivist. Especially if we think on behavioral change as something as a constant, as a long-term goal, how do we enable that transition? Any thoughts, or if you are researching?
I mean, there's a lot of research on social science. I'm not an expert like on all of it, but I would say what I'm not advocating for is definitely seeing your own, yourself as just an individual. But what I am saying, like your capacity to also organize varies a lot by individuals and by context, what is the normal. But I think whenever you mobilize, you would have a much greater influence or likelihood of you influencing whatever outcome you're interested in. And I think it is really important that we see ourselves as being part of a collective. It can also, I mean, there are pros and cons of this because you can also see an in-group and an out-group. So it is quite complicated, but I would say getting at solutions that are also facilitating collective processes and being part of a community, I think is generally important, not only for getting something through, but also making sure that it then is maintained over time and that people are benefiting from that, or people within that community are benefiting from that. So it could be, I mean, you can organize at different levels, and some people can more easily organize, like certain CEOs will come together, they will push for a policy. It's more likely it happens than if we did it. So that, I think that's part of what I'm trying to say. And the same, you can see that at society, you can see in companies, you can see it. So if a small group of lower level employees would organize, you have to organize quite large, I would say, in order for you to influence if it's national. Then if, again, at more leadership level. But I think we shouldn't complete individuals. It's a sum of them.
I'm interested in hearing what gaps in knowledge, data, methodologies would be needed to go all the way from planetary to individual level and back. In the following way, so we know to do 1.5 degree overshoot, as we now call it. We need to get rid of global coal by 2040, global gas by 2050, global oil by 2060, or maybe 5 years later, all of those. So what if we, as a community, we analyze what are the big drivers of global planetary change, and the speed of change. We go and we decompose that into different sectors and services. We take that to an individual level of where behavior that gives rise to those services and the way these services are satisfied gives rise to emissions. Then to decompose the behavior interventions, behavioral change interventions. That by then we have, tens or hundreds of actions and behaviors, some levers to change their behaviors. Then pull all that together in, let's say, families of behavioral change. So ultimately say, okay, this family of behavioral change, which may have sort of a coherent translation to policy, would translate into the largest emission reductions. So where are the key knowledge gaps?
It's a long conversation, but I mean, there are some attempts to look at what we say wedges in climate change mitigation. That's a way to sort of slice it a little bit differently, where you say, if you do this, it will reduce emissions by this much, typically at the global level. But so we have a lot of data gaps, particularly if we go subnational, and that's where it becomes quite complicated. Like some municipalities, cities are trying to operationalize the planetary boundaries framework, for example, at the city level. But from what I hear from the people that do this, it becomes quite a fluffy and very difficult exercise. And in the end, it doesn't necessarily materialize in any sort of different policies. But at the behavioral level, we do have a lot of data gaps on what people are doing. Like, again, you can sometimes do it at the national level, look at national statistics bureaus, like in the countries that have them, that are well developed. But even then, it's quite difficult to sort of dissect. And I think this is why we really need an infrastructure. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be better. And then you can feed back into other modeling exercises. So I've been trying to work with integrated assessment modelers to figure out, like you as a community, you create scenarios where you say, we assume that people eat less meat by this in a certain time. What is the impact then within a systems framework on emissions? And that's one way you can represent that. So I think in the end, it has to flow both directions, I would say. And then obviously it was mentioned, there goes assumption into this, and we can try to improve those over time to make modeling better, and then also feed that into policy processes a lot better. But I think you need to translate it.
I think that's a great place to end.